presented where he identified psychoanalysis as the one institution that addressed suffering and cruelty without alibi, without recourse to metaphysical or metaphorical comforts, that provided a receiving area for thinking about it without immediately finding divergence away from it. Of course, one of those frames would be mourning itself. I personally, as a teenager, was attracted to psychoanalysis because it struck me, and it still strikes me, as being the only science that really addresses mourning as a problem and a process. And I soon found out that mourning is also the very frame of Freudian psychoanalysis, whether in the transference, what have you. And so it's this movement whereby psychoanalysis seems to contain problems that I at least experienced outside of my first contact with psychoanalysis that has always intrigued me. And just to give maybe a final example, in Nazi psychoanalysis, for better or worse, I sought the impossible possibility of taking the continuity that was there, the uncanny continuity, whereby psychoanalysis, however it was named, continued throughout the course of all of German modernity, including National Socialism, that very continuity could be revalorized as a possible or impossible container for our biggest symptom. So the final thing I have to say, getting back to Derrida, is that my relationship to psychoanalysis and politics is deconstructed. Anything that I want to say in the world of politics, I also want to be able to say within the discursivity of psychoanalysis, that any kind of change that I would imagine or would argue for, I want to find reflected somehow in some kind of displacement or mutation, or what have you, rereading within that discursivity itself.
Henri,
but shouldn't you?
Do you want? Can I go first, or do you want to intervene immediately?
Yes. It's more
it's okay.
This dogmatism, Nazism without dogmatism, or Nazism without ideology. I'm surprised because how would you call the Goebbels speech about final solutions?
Goebbels or Himmler? Goebbels made speech on total war.
The final solution.
This is Himmler, I think, in Gdansk usually referred to.
It's an ideology.
No, am I the addressee?
Yes.
Let's cut it short then, in the sense that I can explain this later, because my point was precisely anti-Adorno, that it definitely is ideology, that more than ever ideology is everywhere today, but maybe later.
No, but that's good. He needed to have that. Okay. All right. So I guess what I want to suggest is I guess I want to take up 2 points. One, the question of how the social field is inscribed in my experience that Slavoj introduces, and then Larry's important point that psychoanalysis, according to Derrida, addresses suffering and cruelty without alibi, and also addresses mourning as a process more explicitly than any other theoretical or clinical approach we might find. I think that for me, and I was reflecting upon this recently, that I'm always worried about those psychic formations that will result either in suicide or in murder. So if one were to kind of hold those two possibilities out there as a kind of, as the extremes of psychic life, which obviously, both of which have political instantiations and implications, I guess I would have to roll back a little bit to say that for me, the absence of the possibility of mourning publicly that emerged in the initial years of the AIDS crisis in the United States and elsewhere, and which I think continues in Africa now, that the inability of public mourning was based, I think, in part on a prohibition against acknowledging both the disease of HIV, but also a prohibition against acknowledging homosexuality not only as sexual practice but also as a mode of love, which would bring with it loss and mourning. So in the initial stages, when many men were actually dying and the deaths were kept quiet and there was no public expression of acknowledgement or mourning, an activism struck me as emerging precisely over the question of the absence of public mourning. And of course, in my work on Antigone, I'm still mad about the prohibition on public mourning that Creon, which is the prohibition that Creon imposes, right? And it seems to me that without the possibility of public mourning, and I think we now see that again in our various war efforts, that we have restrictions on the media, what they can show, what they cannot show, and certainly scenes of mourning are cut short. We get very quick clips, for instance, last night at CNN, very quick clips of angry mourning scenes in Lebanon. We don't really even get those scenes very much in Iraq. And the shrouding of the caskets of the US soldiers as they're returned to the US, the fact that photographers are literally asked not to publicize photos of caskets in groups. We're not allowed to see groups of caskets because somehow that would incite a public mourning that might also be related to a public outrage. The necessity of public mourning, and I also understand that there could be a massive abuse of public mourning, and I think we saw that as well post 9/11, which I suggested yesterday. The necessity of public mourning strikes me as something that psychoanalysis can help us think about, because when mourning is foreclosed, and there is no life that is lost, and there was no love that's being grieved, it seems to me that what happens in the melancholic formation that ensues is a heightening of superegoic violence. The other, who is not marked as lost, does become, via the melancholic incorporation, part of the superegoic scene of self-laceration. As Freud says, one continues the quarrel with the other internally. And what I worry about when superegoic violence is given free rein is that it does and can result either in suicide or in murder for a variety of reasons. When Freud talks about moral masochism, for instance, it's an extremely interesting category, because although most of his references to masochism include some quotient of pleasure, the one form of